In Porter's five forces, the threat of new entrants is the likelihood that a company is going to enter your industry and start competing with you. So let's say you have an ice cream shop and you're selling ice cream cones and sundaes to the public, and you have some competitors. The question is, what is the probability that some new entrant, some other company is going to come in and say, I want to start an ice cream shop and start competing with you and your existing competitors? Okay, so that's the threat of new entrants. What is the probability or the chance that someone's going to come into your industry and say, hey, that's an attractive industry. I want to be there. And it's the threat of new entrants is affected by a couple of things. One is the anticipated reaction of the firms that are already in that industry. So when you have this ice cream shop, there's you and then you have some existing competitors. Okay, so there's already firms in the industry. So if a company is thinking of starting a new ice cream shop, they're going to say, well, what do we think that you and your competitors will do if we come and start competing with all of you and start our ice cream shop? Do we expect that you are going to fight back? And we might look and say, okay, well, what is the history? If people started an ice cream shop in the past, was there retaliation by the people that were already in the industry? For example, if I look and see a couple of years ago, somebody else started an ice cream shop and you immediately cut your prices and your competitors cut your prices, and that drove that new entrant out of business, that might give me pause before starting an ice cream shop. Also, I look at, do you have the resources to actually fight back? For example, when I'm talking about resources, cash, unused borrowing capacity. So, for example, if you're looking at a company and you're thinking about entering an industry and the company does not have the ability to borrow anymore because it's already very highly leveraged, then you say, okay, if I were to enter that industry, that company doesn't have the ability to go borrow and do something like launch a new product line or something to potentially compete with me. If they're strapped for cash, it's going to make it harder for them to fight back if a new entrant comes into the industry. Also, you would expect a stronger response from and when I say incumbent firms, I'm talking about companies that are already in the industry. Okay, so the new entrants is looking at these incumbent firms and saying, okay, what's the chance these incumbent firms are going to fight back? So if the incumbent firms have assets that really can only be used in that specific industry, then they're more likely to fight back because that's really all they can do with those assets. They can't repurpose them for another cause. And if the industry has very slow growth, then it's more likely that they basically would fight back, because think about it, like if you have an industry that has very fast growth, and there's a new entrant and they come in and they take some of the market share. Well, if the industry is growing fast, then even if somebody comes in, a new entrant comes in, and you have to give up some of the market share to them, but the whole industry, the whole pie is growing larger. So here's the original industry, and now it grows larger, and even so, even though you're giving away a little slice to a new entrant, the whole market is still growing. So the incumbent firms, they're still growing even though they give up some of the market share. But if it's a slow growing industry, if the industry is not growing, if it's just this size and that's it, if they were to give up a piece of this, then everybody in the industry loses. So the incumbent firms are worse off. So they're more likely to fight back if the industry isn't growing, because by letting a new entrant in, their financial performance is going to decline. So we've got, if the new entrant is going to, if they're smart, look and say, what is the reaction we anticipate from the incumbent firms? But then also they're going to look at barriers to entry in the industry. And there are a lot of potential barriers to entry. I'm just going to go over the ones that Michael Porter, some of the ones that Michael Porter mentioned in his 1980 book, Competitive Strategy, but there are certainly other ones. Economies of scale is one that will jump out at you. Remember, the more units that a company produces, then the lower their cost per unit is going to be, because they're spreading their fixed costs over a larger number of units. Okay, so fixed cost per unit is going to come down as production goes up. So when you are a new entrant, if you're looking and saying, hey, the firms that are already in the industry, they have very strong economies of scale because they're producing a lot of units, their fixed cost per unit is going to be much lower than mine, then you are going to lose money potentially for years. And do you have enough cash and willpower to stay in that industry before you could reach that scale? So that could be a significant barrier. Also, Porter identified product differentiation, and by that, you can think about brand. So if there's for example, if like in the diaper industry, if you think about something like Pampers, a lot of people have been using Pampers for years, and they trust Pampers. They've used it for all their children. And so if you want to come in and establish a diaper brand, it might be difficult because they already have brand loyalty. Now, Bruce Greenwald, in a book called Competition Demystified, actually criticized this product differentiation and said it's really not a barrier to entry, because if you think about like luxury cars, you have like a Mercedes, and you say, well, they have a really strong brand, but that doesn't mean that they can have like above average profits or anything like that, because there's other luxury car brands. There's Lexus and BMW and so forth. But we'll have that discussion in another video. So capital requirements. Think about starting a utility company. So let's say you say, I want to provide electricity to the city of Chicago. Okay, if you want to do that, think about all the money and the infrastructure it would take to be able to provide power to all those people. So you really, you don't have just the average person just say, you know what, I'm going to start a utility company and provide power to 3 million people. Switching costs can also make it difficult for you to enter an industry. Think about, for example, if there's some type of specialized software, and you want to say, okay, well, let's say we're talking about some type of specialized tax prep software, okay, that the tax professionals are using, and you say, okay, I'm going to come in, I think I could build better tax prep software. Well, one of the barriers you're going to have is that all the firms that are currently using the existing tax prep software, for you to convince them to buy your tax prep software, there's going to be these switching costs of, they're going to have to retrain their employees. Okay, so even if you convince them that you have a better type of software to do tax prep, they're going to have to retrain all their employees. And so that is not free. That takes time, and they might have to pay you for training and so forth. So the customer, in some sense, when there's high switching costs, they're a little bit more captive. So it make it difficult for you to come in. Even if you have a better product, they're going to have to take time to train people and so forth to know how to use your product. Distribution channels can be important. If we think about a company like Caterpillar, they make earth-moving equipment, like construction, and they have a very extensive network of dealers, Caterpillar dealers, and so they might have an agreement that says, look, you just are going to sell Caterpillar products and not the products of anybody else. And let's just say there was an agreement like that in place with a dealer, and you come in and say, well, hey, I've got some products you might like to sell. And the dealer says, well, I've already got an agreement. So you might not be able to break into that dealer network. Okay, so that could make things difficult. If we think about proprietary technology, think about things like patents for pharmaceutical drugs. How easy would it be for you to break into an industry as a new entrant if there's some type of patent required to produce that drug or to produce that type of product? Sometimes raw materials, certain firms will already have access to something like a mine to extract certain type of, let's say we're talking about for aluminum, bauxite is what is used to produce aluminum. Let's say there are a few firms that basically have, they've dominated all the bauxite mines, and so it might be difficult for you to enter because you don't have access to that. Yeah. And so favorable locations we can think about is, let's think about Walmart. In the U.S., they started with a strategy of targeting rural locations. They're going to have a large, big box discount retailer in rural areas, and people thought, well, there's not enough people there to support having a big box retailer. Well, they proved them wrong. But if you go to a small town with 5,000 people and there's already a Walmart there, and you say, well, let me also start a company the size of Walmart there. It's like, well, there's only 5,000 people. Is there enough space for a second big box retailer? Probably not. And so Walmart got there first, and they've got the favorable location, and so it'd be difficult for you to enter and kind of replicate what they've done. Government policy, you can think about, for example, licenses. We're talking about starting in the United States, when you want to sell liquor to the public, you need a liquor license, right, to sell alcohol. You can think about, let's say you want to start a law firm. Well, you're going to need a law license. Okay, so licenses and government policy. If we think about the right to have a nuclear power plant, not just anybody, at least in the United States, you can't just say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to start a nuclear power plant. Let's go, let's get some uranium and let's do this. You need to have a license to be able to do that, and they don't just give them out every year. And it's actually very difficult to get a license to have a nuclear power plant. And then in some cases, there might be a really high learning curve in terms of if you're wanting to do, let's say you say, Sal Khan and Khan Academy, that's a nonprofit, but let's say it was a business and you wanted to compete with Sal Khan and create tutorials. You have to have all that knowledge that Sal Khan has of mathematics and so forth. And so there could be a really high learning curve. If we're talking about producing some kind of technology, we're talking about producing laptops or microprocessors or something. Let's say you want to compete with Intel and AMD with microprocessors. It might be a very high learning curve and learning in the beginning stages of how to make microprocessors. So any of these barriers to entry, and you might have several of them present, can make it more difficult for a new entrant to come and actually break into an industry and start competing. And so when we put this in the context of Porter's 5 forces, remember Porter's 5 forces are about assessing the factors that determine the competitiveness or profitability of an industry. So if there are very high barriers to entry, or if we go back to the anticipated reaction of the incumbent firms, like if you anticipate that, if I were to get into this industry, I'm going to have to overcome several of these barriers, and I'm going to expect a negative reaction from the companies that are already in that industry, then you're less likely to want to enter that industry. So an industry with very high barriers to entry is going to deter new entrants and then lead to higher profitability for the incumbent firms, the firms that are already in the industry. So it's good if you're a company to be operating in an industry that has very high barriers to entry, because that's going to lead to more profitability for your firm.